Hello, my name is Vanessa Reid and I'm a PhD researcher at the Department of Archaeology at Durham University. And my research looks at the preservation of early medieval settlement sites in Scotland and how geoarchaeology may be used to interpret and understand some of the factors contributing to that preservation. And almost all of the evidence for the sites that I look at lie below the ground surface, and over the course of my research I've become more and more interested in how climate change is likely to affect the preservation potentials of these buried environments. So the conservation of buried remains in situ, which stay in their original location, is an incredibly important theme in heritage management and in archaeology more broadly. And sites can be preserved in this manner as part of development schemes, following archaeological investigation, or as part of heritage management plans, for example, of waterlogged sites. And in Europe, preservation in situ is solidified under the Valletta Treaty of 1992. And the signing of this treaty prompted a range of research to try and understand the degradation processes that occur within the burial environment, as well as how these processes can be monitored and how decisions about heritage management should be made. However, it's now been 30 years since the treaty was initially signed, and we're seeing a change in this sort of long-held belief that preservation is best done in situ, and it's becoming increasingly challenged by researchers and heritage bodies alike. And a large part of this shift is being driven by climate change prediction and the changes that were already being observed on peat and wetland sites. So in Scotland and in the UK, climate change has been characterised by warmer and wetter winters, hotter and drier summers, and more frequent extreme weather events. And when we're looking at the general impact on buried heritage, it tends to be in terms of the physical washing away of layers of soil and peat that actually exposes those remains, or changes in the physical, biological, and chemical nature of the soil itself. So for example, if we're looking at some sort of recent news articles, this article looks predominantly at the drying out of peat deposits at the Roman sites of Magna and Vindolanda. But we're also seeing examples of this threat to buried heritage at a landscape scale. And this is particularly important when we're considering the value of site preservation in situ, because there's such an important relationship between sites and their landscape setting. And what all of this research is driving is a sort of palpable shift in heritage management towards sort of away from an emphasis on sustainability and mitigation, and towards more of a balanced approach with adaptation, where strategies like excavation are now being put forward as active management plans in a response to climate change predictions. However, there are a number of issues which are still limiting our ability to engage with the risks posed by climate change. And this tends to be a lack of empirical data and baseline understanding. So for example, we have very limited knowledge on the effect of soil changes on preservation potentials, and particularly changes of soil chemistry. There's still very limited information on both the rates of degradation in particular burial environments and the impacts that are occurring on individual sites. And rarer still are studies which focus on the impacts of the degradation on soil features such as pits, ditches and flora surfaces, or deposits such as anthropogenic soils, plagan soils, and the soil horizons. And this is what really got my attention, because in many cases these types of soil features and these soil horizons are often the only evidence that we have for a site. And before we can understand the threat posed by future climate change, we really need to have a firm grasp on the scale and the nature of the processes that are already affecting site preservation. And so this brings me to a very small case study into the preservation of early medieval settlement sites in Scotland. And the reason I wanted to look at this in this area, because early medieval settlement sites typically have very poor levels of preservation. They often lack internal deposits or any observable stratigraphy within structures themselves, and they return generally very few artifacts. Now, there are exceptions, but these exceptions tend to be sort of high profile or fortified sites, and there's a comparative lack of information for more daily life, and it's continued to be a stumbling block for the study of the period. So there's a real need to understand the mechanisms behind this absence of detail. Is it natural? Is it cultural? And how is it likely to change in the future? So I took a subset of sites from across the Northeast and examined site reports for any evidence of processes affecting preservation, essentially to build up this baseline understanding of what's already happening in the area, and then looking towards how that's likely to change as a result of climate change in the future. So we can see that there are quite a number of processes that were recognised on sites. These are the sort of primary processes, and within this there are a few that are predicted to be exacerbated and change due to the climate change predictions of warmer winters, hotter, drier summers, and extreme weather events. So these are attrition as a result of agricultural practices, the blurring of site stratigraphy by plants and animal activity through a process called bioturbation, the poor preservation as a result of aggressive soil conditions, and coastal erosion, which is a sort of very well-known impact of climate change. So if we take each of these in turn and look at how climate change is predicted to alter these preservation potentials. So the major threat in agricultural zones from climate change is the degree to which waterborne soil erosion and soil compaction will increase. These factors are exacerbated by wet conditions, and so are likely to become a more significant problem as we are subjected to these wetter autumns and winters and more extreme and erratic rainfall events. And they have a cumulative effect which essentially thins the plough soil, bringing archaeology closer and closer to the zone of erasure and closer to the plough. And particularly for soil compaction, which can result in the formation of really quite hard crusts. It can require deep and invasive remedial operations like pan busting and subsoiling, which again drive machinery further and further. It's more penetrative into the subsoil and into any surviving archaeology. Another issue is the degree to which plant and animal activity is expected to change. So this is likely to be triggered by increased temperatures and longer growing seasons, which encourage the spread of new and invasive species. It leads to deeper and more penetrative root growth. And as we've seen over the past couple of months, the destruction that can be caused by the uprooting of trees in extreme weather events. And I think that nowhere but in the northeast of Scotland has really taken a brunt of this destruction, and it has decimated landscapes across the northeast. So there is the potential for a lot more increased damage and loss of stratigraphy, which is really important when these soil horizons are one of the very few aspects of archaeology that we can use to interpret and reconstruct sites. And soil chemistry is another one that's predicted to change. Now in Scotland and in the northeast particularly, the soils are typically very acidic and free draining, which means that we have very few examples of organic preservation or waterlogged sites. But where these examples do exist, they're predicted to dry out even further. Soils are predicted, and we're already seeing the acidification of Scotland's soils. And atmospheric carbon dioxide, an increase in that carbon dioxide, has already been linked to greater microbial activity, which again will accelerate the decay and loss of organic material, which when we do get examples of this, for example, on those Roman sites that we saw discussed earlier, they can provide huge insights into these sort of the daily life of people in the past, and this is what we're really missing from these particular site types. And coastal erosion, it's probably the most well-known and evocative impact of climate change that threatens the survival of our cultural heritage. And this extends to buried remains. And the problem with buried remains is that they're often recognised too late. They're recognised by archaeology that's already coming out of exposed erosion phases. And within the study area, a really sort of prominent example of that is Dunaker Promontory Fort in Aberdeenshire. And you can see on the left just how close some of these buried floor layers and features are to active erosion phases. And then on the right, there's a very clear erosion footprint where you can see just how much has been lost. So interpreting these sites becomes more and more difficult as we're losing more and more of that contextual information. So a big question is therefore, how do we ensure the effective management of heritage that is currently being preserved in situ below the ground surface in light of these climate change predictions? Well, I by no means have all the answers, and these are just some musings, but reviewing current policy could be one option. So at the moment, heritage in Scotland and in the UK can be afforded legal protection as scheduled monuments if they're seen to have significant cultural value. So for example, in arable lands, scheduled monuments are protected under the Ancient Monuments Order, which is intended to limit cultivation damage. However, the order can actually control agricultural practices if they are shown to have occurred on the land within the previous 10 years, which means that ploughing can occur at a consistent depth even when plough soil thinning is observed. And this was observed within the study area that I looked at. So as it stands, this is essentially an example of policy which not only enforces the idea of stasis within the burial environment, but can actually be seen to play a passive role in the destruction of buried sites and their deposits. And another issue we need to consider is how effectively are we actually monitoring these sites that are deemed to be of high value and significance? And the current question is not particularly well, because in the most recent report on the monitoring of Scotland's scheduled monuments, it was acknowledged that the scoring system that was used to assess the condition of protected monuments that were buried beneath arable land was not fit for purpose. It didn't provide adequate assessments of remains that were buried beneath the plough soil, and it couldn't produce data that could be combined or compared against other monument types. So there's a real lack of any sort of empirical data with which to assess and scale the changing nature of our buried heritage. So we really need a review of how we are assessing the preservation and the changing preservation of these sites. Now, site monitoring is something that is continuing to gain a big sort of increasing presence in our approach to climate change management, and this can be the monitoring of a number of different preservation impacts, things like oxygen availability, water content, moisture levels. But there are some issues, particularly regarding the incorrect or unnecessary use of monitoring systems. And this article I put up is a really fantastic review that explores this topic very succinctly, just in a couple of pages and really clearly. And what the authors argue is that monitoring of in situ preservation conditions is only really effective in preventing in situ destruction when the changes to that environment are clearly recognizable and they occur over really quite short periods of time. For example, shallow sites that are being dewatered in recently drained wetlands. And the authors also argue that there's actually often very little need for archaeologists to actually engage in complex monitoring systems or with large data sets, and that in reality they're more likely to discourage engagement with these assessments of preservation environments. And so instead they suggest that we look towards a return to more low-tech observations and sort of common sense assessments and estimates that are gathered at the point of excavation, and most importantly, without the need for specialists. And so this therefore takes us back to my own research and interest in the potential that geoarchaeology has to help us develop preservation and accessible preservation assessments. So a broad definition of geoarchaeology is the application of earth science principles and techniques to the archaeological record. But it encompasses so many different aspects and approaches, and it really is sort of primed to aid in the collection of data for the effective management of buried heritage. It suffered perhaps from a bit of a reputation as a specialist field, but in reality, most of our information comes from detailed field descriptions, and so archaeologists who are routinely excavating sites are often best placed to carry out these types of assessments. It requires only sort of basic training to elevate field descriptions into geoarchaeological assessments, and this can include things like the recording of soil colours and the depth of redox boundaries, which can be done as part of day-to-day profile recordings or through small programs of foggering and coring. And this provides comparable data for very little additional time needed, little manpower, and very few additional resources or expenses. So I think in looking towards a future for the preservation of heritage in situ, I think there needs to be a wider integration of accessible techniques that assess preservation environments and produce data that can be compared against each other. And this needs to be done across a wide range of site types and locations, because this will essentially allow us to assess risk and identify sites that are most at risk and in need of a sort of prioritization for adapted heritage management strategies. And it will allow us to improve management strategies because there is that baseline knowledge of how sites are already being affected and how they are likely to be affected given current climate change predictions. So I hope that's been of some interest. Thank you so much for listening. If you have any questions, please do feel free to get in touch. Thank you.